The decree had already been read to 14 other species before it was ever read to humanity. Each time, the result was the same. Silence, then weeping, then submission. The Drathene Empire had a perfect record. 42 civilizations approached. 42 civilizations broken. The ceremony was so well practiced that the Emperor's court had a name for it, the settling. As in, the matter was settled before it began. The Great Hall of Conclave Station Ardent 9 held 200 observers that morning. Diplomats, chancellors, silent witnesses from 17 species. They sat in tiered rows curving around a central floor of black stone, and every single one of them already knew how this would end. Some had seen it before. Others had simply heard enough to understand. When the Drathene flag was raised above the entry arch, a deep red field, no symbols, no words, just the color of what was coming. 3 of the alien delegates quietly turned their chairs away from the floor. Not in protest, just to avoid watching. Chancellor Bryn of the Neutral Conclave stood at the podium in the center and read the opening formalities in a voice that had gone completely flat. He was an old being. He had presided over 2 previous settlings. He did not enjoy his job today. Emperor Vormalek arrived without announcement. He did not need one. He was 9 feet of armored chitin, blue-white bioluminescence running in slow pulses down the length of his arms, and he moved the way things move when they have never once been told to stop. His court filed in behind him. 20 advisors, 10 soldiers standing along the far wall, and voice advisor Sula, who walked at the Emperor's left shoulder and said nothing, only watched. The humans were late. Not by accident. By 3 minutes exactly, which Sula would later note in his private records as the first unusual thing. Ambassador Dara Solano entered through the side passage with 2 people behind her. One was Sergeant Ren Adeyemi, who was built like someone had decided that furniture should be capable of violence. The other was a junior aide carrying nothing but a satchel. Dara herself was wearing a dark gray uniform with no medals and no rank markers, and she was holding a small ceramic cup of something that was still producing a thin thread of steam. She took a sip as she walked to the human delegation's chair and sat down. She did not look at the Emperor. She looked at the table, then at Chancellor Bryn, and gave him a small nod as if to say, "Go ahead." Bryn went ahead. The decree of extinction took 4 minutes to read aloud. It named every human-controlled star system. It listed Earth's population, Mars's population, the 7 orbital stations, the colony counts on 3 outer worlds. It stated the projected timeline for total Drathene military engagement. It gave humanity 14 months. The hall was absolutely silent when Bryn finished. Every eye went to Dara. This was the part of the ceremony where the representative of the targeted species was expected to respond. In the past, responses had ranged from immediate and total capitulation to weeping pleas for mercy to elaborate offers of tribute. One species had sent their entire ruling council into prostration on the Blackstone floor. The Drathene had found that one particularly efficient. Dara set her cup down on the table. She looked up at Emperor Vormalek. She took one breath. "Is that your final offer?" The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. The first silence had been the silence of dread. This one was something else entirely. It was the silence of 200 minds, all trying to process the same information at the same time, and none of them getting there. Vormalek did not move. His bioluminescent markings pulsed once, slowly. Sula blinked. It was the only visible reaction in the entire Drathene delegation, and it lasted less than a second, but Dara saw it because she was watching for exactly that. One of the alien delegates in the upper tier made a sound that his species used when encountering something that did not fit any known category. Another put both of his upper hands over the lower half of his face. Chancellor Bryn closed both of his eyes slowly, the way a being closes their eyes when they have accepted something terrible. The Emperor's voice, when it came, was deep enough to feel in the floor. "You understand what was just read to you?" It was not a question. Dara answered it anyway. "Yes," she said. "Every word. That's why I'm asking if it's final. No point discussing terms on something that isn't negotiable." She picked up her cup again. "Is it negotiable?" Vormalek stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Chancellor Bryn and told him to recess the session for 2 hours. Bryn recessed the session. As the hall began to move and murmur around her, Dara finished her drink. Sergeant Wren leaned down and spoke one quiet word near her ear. Dara shook her head slightly. Not yet. She set the empty cup aside and looked at the black stone floor with an expression that was not fear, and was not arrogance, and was not performance. It was the look of someone who had done the math and was comfortable with the numbers. Outside, in the corridors, the alien delegates spoke in rapid, hushed tones. The word moving through 17 different translation filters, passed from mouth to mouth across species lines, was not brave. It was not foolish either. The closest translation, in most languages present, was simply, again. As if they were waiting to see if she would ask it again. She would. Sula found her in the side chamber off the east corridor, the one with no windows and a single long table and chairs that had been built for species with 3 joints per leg. Dara was sitting in one anyway, perfectly comfortable, reading something on a data slate. She did not look up when he entered. He closed the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, studying her the way a person studies a locked box they have never seen before and cannot decide if they want to open. "You are the first," he said finally. "The first what?" Dara asked. "The first representative of a decreased species to ask that question." "Which question?" "You know which question." Dara set the slate down. She looked at him with calm, patient eyes. "Then I'm surprised no one asked it before me. It seems like the obvious thing." Sula pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He was smaller than most Dratheen, lean, gray-plated, with eyes that ran through 3 color shifts when he was thinking hard. They were shifting now. "I want to help you," he said. "I want you to understand what the decree means." "I understand what it means." "You behaved as though you did not." "No," Dara said. "I behaved as though I did." "That's different." She folded her hands on the table. "Walk me through what you think I missed." Sula accepted that. He had dealt with many species. He knew how to read resistance, and this did not look like resistance. It looked like genuine invitation. He began speaking. He listed the Dratheen fleet numbers, the total count of active warships across 9 sectors, the response time from their nearest staging point to human space. He talked about the 42. He described 3 of them in brief detail, civilizations that had been technically capable of armed resistance and had chosen not to fight because the math did not favor them. He laid it all out carefully, generously, the way a person shows someone a door and says, "Please use it." Dara listened to everything. Then she opened her satchel and placed a data slate on the table and slid it across to him. "Admiral Okafor put this together," she said. "He's commanding the human escort currently parked about 40 minutes out. 40 warships. He asked me to share this during the recess if the conversation went in this direction." Sula picked up the slate. He read. The document was titled "The Cost of Being Right." It was 11 pages long and written in plain language with no decoration and no drama. It began with a clear acknowledgement. The Dratheen would win a war against humanity. It said so directly in the second sentence. Then it spent 10.5 pages explaining what winning would cost. The projections were built on 200 years of human military data, Dratheen engagement records gathered from public conclave archives, and 3 independent modeling runs. They accounted for human industrial output across 12 star systems, the decentralized nature of human governance, which meant there was no single capital to take, and what the document called the persistence variable, a factor added to account for the documented human tendency to continue fighting long after the point at which other species had historically stopped. The projected Dratheen losses range from 34% of total fleet strength on the low end to 60% on the high end. Core system economic disruption was estimated at 2 to 3 centuries of recovery time. The final page had a single line. "We are not presenting this to suggest the outcome is in doubt. We are presenting it to suggest the outcome is not free." The document was dated 4 months ago. It had been prepared before the conclave invitation was even sent. Sula read it twice. The color shift in his eyes had stopped moving. They had settled on a pale, still amber. "Who else has seen this?" he asked. "Admiral Okafor." "Me. My aide. And now you." Dara paused. "And Vormalek, if you choose to share it. He will not like it." "I know. He may take it as a provocation. You can tell him we meant it as information. The 2 things are different." Sula set the slate down carefully. He looked at it for another moment, then looked at her. "Why show me? Why not present this in the hall?" Dara considered the question. "Because in the hall it becomes a performance. Everyone watches everyone else react. The Emperor has to respond to the room, not to the document. She glanced at the slate. This is a document about mathematics. It should be read quietly. Sula was silent for a long time. The kind of silence that was not empty. There are 40 warships outside, he finally said. Yes. The decree was issued against a civilization with 12 star systems and several billion people. Yes. And you came here with 40 ships and one question. Dara almost smiled. Not quite. The ships aren't the point. The question is the point. She stood, smoothing the front of her uniform. The Emperor has my answer when he's ready. We're not going anywhere. She left the chamber. Sula sat alone with the slate for a while longer. Then he picked it up and walked back toward the Emperor's private corridor. He passed Counselor Doss in the hall, one of the inner court members who had served Vermalek for 30 years and who had, over those 30 years, developed a careful habit of paying attention to things the Emperor did not ask him to notice. Doss saw the slate in Sula's hands. He said nothing, but he watched which way Sula walked. The second session began with rain. Not real rain. Conclave Station Ardent 9 had an atmospheric system in the upper observation ring that occasionally misfired, and a thin cold drizzle came down through a maintenance vent above the east gallery and fell on the empty chairs up there with a quiet, steady sound. Nobody fixed it. Nobody moved. The 200 observers filed back in and found their places and sat in their damp or dry seats depending on where they were sitting, and the drizzle kept falling, and Vermalek walked to the floor of the hall, and it was somehow fitting. He had read The Cost of Being Right. Nothing in his posture said this. His bioluminescent markings ran at the same slow pulse. His court stood at the same positions. Sula was at his left shoulder where he always was. But Dara, who had spent 12 years reading rooms, noticed that the Emperor had chosen to stand 2 steps closer to the human delegation's table than he had the previous session. Not aggressive, closer to engaged. The kind of small shift a person makes when a conversation has moved from dismissal to something else. She sat. She waited. Vermalek spoke first. The document your admiral prepared, he said. It assumes your species fights in a unified manner. It doesn't, Dara said. It accounts for the opposite. Humanity is not unified. We have never been unified. The model treats each human government and colony system as an independent resistance unit. That's where the persistence variable comes from. There is no single command structure to break. A quiet murmur moved through the alien galleries above. Vermalek's markings pulsed once. Every species we have faced has had one throat to cut. We have several billion, Dara said. And historically, cutting one has made the others angrier. The murmur grew briefly, then died. Vermalek was quiet for a moment. Then he moved on, the way a creature moves past something it has decided to address later. The decree stands, he said. However, he let that word sit. There is an alternative. He looked at her with the full weight of 3 centuries of undefeated rulership and offered humanity what he called a merciful reclassification. Earth and its colonies would surrender sovereign status. 10 million humans per cycle would be assigned to Dominion labor programs across 7 sectors. In exchange, the extinction timeline would be suspended indefinitely and humanity would exist as a protected Dominion territory. He said the word protected the way someone says a word they do not usually need, because the things they protect do not usually require explanation. Dara reached into her satchel. She took out a single sheet of physical paper. She picked up the pen sitting near her translation unit and wrote one thing on the paper. Then she slid it across the table. The paper had a number on it. 0. That is how many human governments agreed to the terms you just described, Dara said. I ran the survey during the recess. I contacted 31 separate governing bodies across Earth, Mars, the orbital stations, and the outer colonies. The number that said yes is 0. She folded her hands. The most polite rejection came from a small council on one of the outer stations. They said no thank you. The least polite came from the Martian Federated Council. I won't translate it directly because Chancellor Bryn is present, but the general meaning was, absolutely not. She slid a second sheet across. It was a log of 31 response timestamps, each tagged with a governing body identifier. Vermalek looked at the paper. He looked at the log. His eyes moved across them slowly. Sula, standing behind him, read both over his shoulder, and his eye color shift started up again. You surveyed your own people, Vermalek said, during a formal conclave session. Of course, Dara said. I'm a representative. I represent people. It seemed important to know what they thought before I accepted anything on their behalf. No species has done that. Most species have one government, Doris said. We have several dozen. Some of them disagree with each other on most things. On this particular question, they agreed very quickly. She paused. That should probably tell you something. A very long silence. Somewhere above, the drizzle from the broken vent kept falling on the empty chairs. Vermalek straightened to his full height. His voice came down from that height with all of its weight. The decree is confirmed. You have 72 hours to produce a surrender proposal or the engagement timeline begins. He looked at Dara the way he had looked at 42 species before her. The look that said, "Now you understand." Dara looked back at him. "Is that your final offer?" she asked. The hall held its breath. Vermalek turned and walked out. His court followed. Sula followed. Counselor Doss followed, but slowly, half a step behind the others, and as he passed the human delegation's table, he looked at the sheet of paper with the 0 on it. He stood there for just a moment too long. His eyes moved from the 0 to Dara. She met his eyes. He left. The hall exhaled. Delegates stood and talked in urgent clusters. Chancellor Bryn came to the podium and said something procedural that no one listened to. Sergeant Wren placed a fresh cup of something warm near Dara's hand without being asked. Dara picked it up. She looked at the door the Emperor had walked through. 72 hours. She was not afraid of that number either. Aboard the ISV Constant, 40 minutes out from Ardent 9, Admiral Ren Okafor was losing a game of chess against himself. Not because he was bad at chess. He was very good at chess. He was losing on purpose, playing the black pieces worse than he was capable of, because he wanted to understand what losing looked like from the inside. He had been doing this for 6 months. He found it instructive. His aide, Lieutenant Ferris, stood near the door to the Admiral's quarters with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned not to interrupt the chess games. He had also learned not to comment on them. He watched the board and waited. Okafor moved a piece. He studied the result. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, without looking up, "She asked it again." Ferris checked his comm. The question. The question. That's twice now. Okafor moved another piece. They recessed the session and issued a 72-hour deadline. She held the line. Ferris was quiet for a moment. He had been with Okafor for 4 years and had learned to wait out the pauses. Should we alert the home systems? The deadline. They were alerted 6 months ago, Okafor said. Before the conclave invitation was accepted. Every colony, every station, every ship we have in active service has had 6 months to prepare. This conversation was never expected to succeed. Then what was it expected to do? Okafor finally looked up from the board. He was an old man with a wide, quiet face, and he had the eyes of someone who had been looking at the long view for so long that the short view no longer surprised him. Every session in that hall is recorded by the conclave and shared with all member species, he said. Every word, every moment, every reaction. He looked back at the board. When the Drathene began the decree against the Rethali 40 years ago, do you know what happened? Ferris shook his head. The other species watched. They saw the Rethali weep and beg and accept terms. And they thought, that is what you do. That is the only option. When your turn comes, you do that. He picked up the White King and turned it in his fingers. No one thought to ask whether there was another way, because no one had ever seen another way tried. Ferris was still. We are being watched by 17 civilizations right now, Okafor said. Some of them are under existing decrees. Some will receive them in the future. All of them are watching a human ambassador sit across from the most powerful military force in this part of the galaxy and ask, twice now, whether its terms are final. He set the king back down. That is worth more than 40 ships. That is the record. That is the thing that lasts. Ferris looked at the comm in his hand. And if the deadline runs, and they come for us anyway? Then we fight, Okafor said simply. And the record still exists. And species who have never fought back will have watched us choose to. He moved a piece. The cost of fighting is high. The cost of teaching everyone around you that there is only one option is higher. Ferris nodded slowly. He didn't fully agree, but he had learned that not fully agreeing with Okafor was a position you held carefully and quietly. Back on the station, Dara walked. She did not pace. Pacing implied anxiety, and she was not anxious. She simply moved through the corridors of Ardent 9 because she thought better when her feet were doing something her brain did not have to supervise. The The delegates found her anyway. The first was a tall, rust-colored diplomat from the Oresi people, a species that had been under a Drathene supervisory accord for 60 years, which was the Dominion's polite name for conquest. He fell into step beside her without asking. He said nothing for almost a full corridor. Then he pressed a data chip into her hand without looking at her and walked away. The chip, Sergeant Wren confirmed later, contained Drathene fleet patrol schedules for the sector nearest human space. 60 years of careful observation by a people who had nothing else to do but watch. The second was a pair of delegates from a species Dara did not immediately recognize. They were small and moved in short bursts, and they stopped in front of her and spoke quickly in their own language, which her translation unit handled in pieces. The gist was, "We have seen this before. We cannot help. We are sorry." Dara told them not to be sorry. One of them pressed her hand, both of its small hands wrapping around hers, and then they were gone. The third was no one. Just an empty alcove off the corridor, and Dara stepped into it, and stood there for a moment with the data chip in one hand and the memory of small hands in the other, and for the first time in 3 days something crossed her face that was not composure. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then she put it away. Not buried, not crushed, just set aside the way you set aside things you will return to later when the work is done. She had grown up in a family of 5 on a small colony in the Outer Ring, where the work was always one thing and the feeling about the work was always something you handled after. She was still that person. She went back to her quarters and wrote her final brief. At the end, she wrote, "They have never lost. They do not know what losing teaches you. We do." She sent it home. Then she slept. The third session opened differently. Not in any way that most observers would have caught. The chairs were in the same positions. The hall was lit the same way. Chancellor Bryn stood at the same podium and opened with the same procedural language he always used. But 2 things were different, and Dara noticed both of them before she sat down. First, Counselor Doss was no longer standing at the Emperor's right hand. He had been moved back to the second row of the Drathene court, which in their hierarchy meant he had either been punished or removed from the inner circle of trust. His face showed nothing, but he was watching. Second, Vermalic did not begin with the decree. He was silent for a full minute after taking his position on the floor. A long, deliberate silence. Not the silence of a being who had nothing to say. The silence of a being who was choosing, for the first time, what to say instead of what they had always said. Then he asked, "What does humanity want?" The alien galleries went very still. Sula, at the Emperor's left, closed his eyes for just a moment. Later he would write in his private notes that those 4 words were the most significant thing Vermalic had said in 30 years, because they were the first 4 words he had ever directed at a decree species that were not part of the script. The script was very good. It had worked 42 times. But it had no room in it for that question. "Humanity wants 3 things," she said. Full recognition as a sovereign peer civilization under conclave law. Open access to Dominion-controlled transit lanes on standard commercial terms. And a mutual non-aggression framework with 5-year review intervals. She paused. "Those are not opening positions. They are the actual positions." Laughter came from somewhere in the Drathene court. Not from Vermalic. Not from Sula. But from someone in the third row who had heard enough of these sessions to find the idea genuinely funny. A species under a decree of extinction asking for trade access and diplomatic parity. The laughter stopped when Vermalic turned his head slightly toward where it had come from. The hall was quiet again. "In exchange," Dara continued, as if the laughter had not happened, "we are offering the Dominion something it has never been offered by any species it has approached." She slid the document across. It was titled, "What We Could Do Together." It was not a surrender. It was not a tribute offer. It was a formal military alliance proposal. It outlined human tactical doctrine across 6 categories, each representing a field of warfare that the Drathene Dominion's own records, as gathered from conclave archives, showed they had struggled with at least once in the past century. Asymmetric warfare, decentralized logistics under contested supply lines, rapid production scaling during active conflict, psychological operations, attrition resistance, and one section titled simply Novel Approaches, which contained a summary of 14 combat innovations developed by human militaries over 2 centuries of fighting each other in conditions ranging from asteroid belts to ocean floors to pressurized city corridors. The Dratheen had conquered 42 species. None of them had fought each other. None of them had fought at all until the Dratheen arrived. Humanity had never stopped. Vermalik read the document. He read it slowly. His advisors leaned in. Sula read it over his shoulder, and his eyes cycled through 4 color shifts in 2 minutes, which Dara had never seen before and took to be significant. The hall waited. "You are genuinely offering this," Vermalik said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Dara said. "Full alliance. Not submission. Not protectorate. Alliance between peers." Another pause. "And if we decline?" "Then I go home," Dara said. "And the next person you hear from will be Admiral Okafor. He's a fair man, but he communicates primarily through ship formations, and his patience is considerably shorter than mine." Vermalik looked at her. The bioluminescence along his arms ran in a long, slow wave, the kind of movement his species made not when they were angry, but when they were recalculating something fundamental. Then, from the second row of the Dratheen court, Counselor Doss spoke. He spoke quietly, without permission, which was not permitted in formal session. He said, "The first document assumed we would fight 42. This assumes we would be fighting alongside 43. His voice was steady. "There is a difference. It is not a small one." The silence that followed was absolute. Vermalik did not look at Doss. He did not punish the interruption, which was itself a kind of response. He kept his eyes on Dara, and he was still for a long time. Then he said, "Recess the session." Bryn recessed it. Sula walked out behind the Emperor, and as he passed the human table, he set something down without stopping, a small piece of paper, folded once. Sergeant Wren picked it up and handed it to Dara. She read it. It said, "He is reading the second document again. That is not nothing." Dara folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. It was not nothing. The word suspended was chosen by Vermalik personally, and Dara accepted it without comment. Not rescinded. Not withdrawn. Suspended. The decree of extinction against humanity was formally placed in a suspended file under conclave record, pending the outcome of ongoing diplomatic review. It was the most indirect possible way to say that the Emperor of the Dratheen Dominion had decided not to destroy humanity. Vermalik signed the suspension with the same pen he had signed every decree with for 30 years, and he did not look at anyone while he did it. Dara signed the accord on the human side of the table. It was officially titled the Mutual Strategic Review and Commercial Access Framework, which was the single most boring name for the most important document in human history, and she had written the title herself. She had chosen the words deliberately. Nothing in the title threatened anyone. Nothing declared victory. It was the kind of document that could sit in an archive without causing anyone to feel that they had lost. Vermalik had felt enough things in this hall already. When the signing was done, Chancellor Bryn made a short speech about the ongoing importance of the neutral conclave and the value of dialogue between civilizations. He spoke in his usual flat voice, but his hands, both of them, were pressed together in front of him in a gesture that his species used for gratitude. He did not explain the gesture. He did not need to. The alien galleries were very quiet as people filed out. Not the anxious quiet of before. A different kind. The kind that comes after something has shifted and no one is yet sure how far. Sula waited until most of the hall had cleared. Then he walked to the human delegations table, where Dara was packing her satchel and Sergeant Wren was standing with the stillness she always maintained in post-session spaces. Sula looked at Dara with his eye color in the pale amber it settled into when he was thinking clearly. 42 times, he said. Every species asked us how to make us stop. Dara looked up from the satchel. You never did, he said. Not once in 3 days. You never asked how to appease him. What? Dara thought about it for a genuine moment. Not a diplomatic moment, an actual one. Because appeasement only works, she said, if the other side eventually gets full. We had the impression you don't. Sula was quiet. We've been hungry before, Dara said. We know what hunger that doesn't stop looks like. You negotiate with it differently than you negotiate with hunger that will eventually be satisfied. She closed the satchel. You negotiate with it the way we did. Sula nodded once, slowly. I will remember that, he said. So will we, said Sergeant Wren. Sula looked at her. She had spoken exactly 4 words in 3 days of sessions, and those 4 were the last ones. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded again, and left. Dara looked at Wren. Wren picked up the satchel and handed it to her without comment. Dara took it. They left the hall. Aboard the ISV Constant, Okafor received the signed framework and read it twice. Then he sat back and looked at the chessboard on his table, still mid-game, still losing on purpose. He thought about picking up the white king. He decided to leave it. The game could wait. The game had always been able to wait. He sent one message home. Framework signed. Coming back. Then he made a cup of tea, sat in his chair, and looked out at the stars with the particular satisfaction of an old man who had bet on something that most people thought was a bad bet and had been proven, not spectacularly, but correctly, right. The years that followed were not simple. The accord held, but it creaked. The 5-year reviews were long and difficult, and the first one nearly collapsed over transit lane pricing in a sector neither side had considered important until suddenly it was. Vor Malak remained emperor. He never publicly acknowledged that the events at Ardent 9 had surprised him. Sula wrote a long internal memo about the negotiations that became required reading in the Drathene Diplomatic Corps, though it was never officially endorsed by the court. Councillor Doss was quietly reinstated to the inner court after the first review cycle. No announcement was made. He was simply there again one day, standing at the right position, and no one said anything about it. 3 other species who had been living under existing Drathene supervisory accords filed formal conclave requests to renegotiate their terms. They each cited the Ardent 9 framework as legal precedent. 2 of those renegotiations succeeded. The third was still ongoing. Okafor retired. He played chess against himself, won more often now, and occasionally wrote short papers on military history that were read by a small number of interested people and ignored by everyone else, which he found entirely acceptable. Dara was appointed to a permanent liaison post. She kept the paper notepad. She still used it. Somewhere in the Drathene Dominion's official archive, Decree number 43 sat in a suspended file with a standard review marker attached. A clerk, at some point, had added a handwritten annotation in the margin in old Drathene script. Translated, it read, "They asked if it was our final offer." Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "We still do not have a good answer." No one knew who had written the second line. No one removed it.